Kale's hands moved through soil that had never touched earth. The hydroponic substrate felt wrong. Too uniform, too sterile, each granule identical to the last. Real dirt had variance. Character. History pressed into sediment layers. This was engineered medium, optimized for root penetration and nutrient distribution, perfect in every measurable way, and lifeless because of it. He adjusted the nitrogen feed to Bay 7, watching the readout stabilize. The tomatoes didn't care that their roots grew in artificial substrate. They fruited on schedule, photosynthesized efficiently, died and were replaced without protest. Sometimes Kale envied them. The station's third shift had started an hour ago. Beyond the garden's transparent dome, Europa's ice surface stretched toward a horizon that curved too sharply, reminding him he lived on a moon barely large enough to hold atmosphere. Jupiter dominated half the sky, bands of ochre and rust turning slowly. Beautiful and indifferent. He'd been here 6 years, long enough that his body had adjusted to the lower gravity, long enough that Earth felt hypothetical, a place he'd left intentionally and thoroughly. The gardens didn't ask why he'd come. They didn't wonder why he stayed when others cycled through 18-month rotations and departed with relief. The comm chimed. Kale ignored it, focused on coaxing a stubborn pepper plant to accept a graft. The technique required patience, align the cambium layers precisely, maintain steady pressure, wait for the plant to decide whether to accept or reject the union. Force it, and both pieces died. The comm chimed again, then again. Kyle set down his grafting blade and activated the channel. Bay 4. Doctor. Vansa. The voice carried an accent he couldn't place, syllables shaped by a mouth not built for human phonemes. Consortium medical priority. You're listed as emergency contact for planetary biological resources. His hands went still. I work in agriculture. Your classification is broader. You're human. Kyle looked at his reflection in the dome glass. 38 years old, lean from years in reduced gravity, forgettable in the way of people who'd spent too long alone. So are 40 billion others. In proximity to consortium space, your cohort number's approximately 12,000. You're the nearest. We're transmitting coordinates. The connection severed before he could refuse. He stood in the silence that followed, surrounded by plants that required his attention in measured, predictable ways. The pepper graft would fail without constant pressure. The tomatoes in Bay 7 needed harvesting within 48 hours. The lettuce rotation demanded replanting by week's end. A ship arrived 12 hours later. The medical vessel was larger than Europa Station, its hull composed of materials that seemed to shift between metallic and organic, depending on the angle of light. Kale had seen consortium ships before. They occasionally stopped for resupply, but never one that moved with this kind of urgency, dropping out of faster-than-light transit so close to the moon that Jupiter's magnetosphere screamed protest. They didn't ask if he'd come. They explained the situation in terms that assumed his cooperation: a plague, a failure of collective intelligence, billions infected, humans uniquely resistant. They needed his presence, not his tissue. 6 months of proximity exposure, protocols designed for minimal invasion, compensation beyond calculation. And if I refuse? Kale asked, already knowing. The consortium physician, crystalline neural casing visible through translucent skin, body structure vaguely humanoid in the way evolution occasionally repeated successful patterns, made a gesture he couldn't interpret. Refusal is documented as option. Probability of selection remains unchanged. They were polite, scrupulously so. They never mentioned the numbers, how many would fragment without treatment, how refusal would condemn populations that had engineered suffering out of existence 3 million years ago. They didn't need to. Kyle had always been competent at math. He packed a single bag. The gardens would survive without him. Someone would adjust the feeds, harvest the tomatoes, replant the lettuce. The pepper graft would fail, but pepper plants were replaceable. Everything was replaceable except apparently him. The ship's interior defied comfortable geometry. Corridors curved in directions his inner ear insisted were impossible. The air tasted recycled through systems that had never processed oxygen for human lungs. Gravity fluctuated between steps, adjusted by mechanisms he couldn't perceive. They installed him in a chamber connected to another by a transparent membrane. Temperature controlled, atmosphere optimized. monitoring equipment embedded in surfaces that looked organic until he touched them and felt cool metal. On the other side of the membrane, a medical bed waited, empty. "Your assignment arrives within the hour," the physician said. "Serath, Valen species, infected 42 days. Prognosis without intervention, complete neural fragmentation within 96 hours. Kyle set his bag on the narrow bed that would be his for 6 months. What do I do? Breathe. Exist. Maintain proximity. The physician's multifaceted eyes reflected his image a dozen times, each slightly different. We'll monitor variables. You provide presence. That's it? Presence is more complex than your species acknowledges. You'll understand. They left him alone in a room designed for optimal atmospheric exchange, waiting for a stranger who needed his breathing to survive. Serath arrived strapped to a medical transport, neural casing fractured in patterns that made Kale think of ice breaking over deep water. They transferred her carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter what remained of her consciousness. She didn't resist. He wasn't sure she could. The physicians worked quickly, establishing monitoring baselines, adjusting atmospheric composition, calibrating the membrane between chambers to allow maximum biochemical exchange while maintaining quarantine protocols. They spoke in frequencies beyond human hearing. Kyle felt the vibrations in his chest. Then they withdrew, and he was alone with her. Serath lay motionless for 3 hours. Kyle sat on his bed, watching her breathe. The rhythm was wrong, too irregular, pauses too long, each inhalation seeming to require conscious effort. Her species' crystalline neural structure should have automated respiratory function, but the plague disrupted everything, forcing her to remember how to draw breath when fragmented consciousness couldn't hold the memory from one moment to the next. He found himself synchronizing his breathing to hers, unconsciously trying to establish a pattern she might follow. Inhale when she did. Hold during her 2 long pauses. Exhale slowly, modeling the rhythm. Halfway through the 4th hour, her breathing stabilized slightly. The physicians checked monitors remotely, said nothing, adjusted nothing. Kyle kept breathing, a metronome in flesh. By the 6th hour, Serath's eyes opened, multifaceted, alien, tracking across her chamber without focusing on anything. Then they found him. He watched her watching him, neither speaking. What could he say? Hello seemed absurd. Are you all right was answered by her presence here. He settled for meeting her gaze, letting her see him see her, presence acknowledged by presence. Her hand moved, small motion, barely controlled, reaching toward the membrane between them, fingers trembling with effort or intention. She couldn't cross it, protocols were absolute, but her hand rested against the transparent surface, palm flat, crystalline skin catching light. Kyle stood slowly, crossed the 3 meters separating his bed from the membrane. He raised his own hand, placed it opposite hers, not touching but aligned. Heat from his palm fogged the membrane slightly. Serath's breathing deepened. The fractures in her neural casing stopped spreading. They stood like that until his legs ached, until her arm trembled with fatigue, until the ship's lighting cycled to simulate night. Then, without discussion, they lowered their hands and retreated to their separate beds. In the darkness, Kyle listened to her breathe and wondered what he'd agreed to. Days acquired routine. Kyle woke when the lighting brightened, watched Serath surface from whatever fragments of consciousness she could maintain through sleep. Her eyes always found him first thing, as if confirming his presence before attempting other thoughts. He learned to read her fracturing. When coherence held, her breathing stayed steady, her movements deliberate. When consciousness splintered, her hands shook, her eyes lost focus. Her entire body seemed to forget how to exist as unified system. In those moments, he moved closer to the membrane, let her see him clearly. Sometimes spoke in low tones about nothing important. The gardens he'd left, the particular stubbornness of pepper plants, the way tomatoes smelled when you brushed against their leaves. She couldn't respond much. Language required sustained thought, connections between concepts her fragmenting mind couldn't maintain. But sometimes, in moments of relative clarity, she whispered fragments. "Thank you," that sounded like grief. Sorry for needing what he gave without choosing. Questions about being human that scattered before she could complete them. The physicians monitored everything. Pheromone concentrations, electromagnetic patterns, biochemical markers in the air they shared. They measured his presence in parts per billion, quantified healing and reduced fracture propagation rates. They didn't measure what Kyle felt, the weight of being looked at like salvation, the responsibility of breathing while someone's consciousness depended on the rhythm, the strange intimacy of sitting in silence with a dying stranger who knew the sound of his heartbeat better than his name. Serath moved closer as days passed, not violating protocols, those boundaries were absolute, but shifting within permitted parameters, positioning herself where his breath would cross the membrane most effectively, where she could see the rise and fall of his chest, the pulse at his throat, the small movements that confirmed he remained present and alive. Kyle found himself mirroring the behavior, sitting where she could see him easily, staying in her line of sight even when he could have retreated to his bed, reading the fragmentation in her eyes and adjusting his proximity accordingly, closer when she struggled, steady when she stabilized, present without crowding. On the 8th day, she spoke a complete sentence. What is it like? What? Being alone, inside yourself, always. The words came slowly, carefully, assembled. We never were. Thoughts were shared. Default. Now I'm... Her hands moved, gesture he couldn't interpret. Trapped. Falling. No one to catch. Kyle settled on the floor near the membrane, close enough that she could see him without effort. It's ordinary for us. Lonely sometimes, but... He searched for words. You learn to build bridges, language, touch, presence. You choose to share instead of assuming connection. Choice. She tested the word. Not necessity, not function. Wanting to. Yes. Do you? Want to? Her eyes held his. Or are you here because billions need you? He should have had an easy answer. Duty, responsibility, moral obligation, words that made the choice simple. Instead he said, both, and I don't know which is stronger. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Her species' facial structure couldn't make that shape. But recognition, understanding. The shared acknowledgement that need and want could blur until separating them became impossible. She placed her hand against the membrane again. Kyle matched it. Heat from his palm fogged the surface between them, a boundary neither could cross, but both could acknowledge. 12 hours. That was the protocol maximum for daily exposure. Serath began requesting it consistently, and Kyle found himself arriving early, staying late, filling the permitted time completely. The physicians adjusted atmospheric ratios, optimized biochemical exchange, measured healing in nanometers of neural repair. They treated proximity as clinical intervention, quantifiable and controlled. Inside the chambers, something else developed. Serath's coherence improved incrementally. She could sustain conversation for minutes now, thoughts connecting across longer spans. She asked questions about human existence, not the biology which the consortium had documented exhaustively, but the experience. What loneliness felt like, how desire differed from need, why humans built religions and art and elaborate rituals around connection when their minds were already separate. Kyle answered honestly, describing the exhausting work of being understood, the relief of being seen, the strange paradox that isolation made chosen intimacy more precious. He talked about his years alone on Europa, the gardens that never judged his silence, the deliberate distance he'd maintained from anyone who might ask questions about why he'd left Earth so thoroughly. "Were you running?" Serath asked one day, her voice steadier than he'd heard it. "From what?" "I don't know. Your voice changes when you talk about Earth, like regret, or fear of regret." Kyle looked at his hands. "There was someone. A long time ago. We were good together. Then we weren't. I didn't handle the end well. What happened? I left, got as far from her as geography allowed, spent 6 years perfecting the art of being alone." He met Serath's eyes. "Turns out I was competent at it." "Competent," she echoed. "Not happy. They're not the same thing." Serath shifted closer to the membrane, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns in her crystalline skin, the way light refracted through fractures that were healing, slowly, because he kept breathing in her proximity. "Do you think," she said carefully, That we choose isolation because it's easier than risking connection again? The question landed in his chest like recognition. Yes. They sat in silence after that, but it felt different. Not comfortable exactly, but honest. Two isolated consciousnesses acknowledging the distance between them and the effort it took to bridge it. Days became weeks. The routine deepened. Wake, confirm presence, exist in proximity, navigate the strange intimacy of being essential to someone's survival while learning their mind through fragments and silences. Serath told him about her research before the plague. Quantum biology, studying the ways consciousness emerged from physical substrate. She'd been brilliant, published, respected. Then the infection came, and everything she'd built, knowledge, reputation, identity, fragmented into disconnected shards she couldn't assemble into continuous self. I can feel it, she said one evening, the gaps, where thoughts should connect but don't, like missing stairs. I step and there's nothing, and I fall until I remember I'm falling, but by then I've forgotten what I was climbing toward. Kyle moved closer to the membrane without thinking. Is it better? When I'm here, the stairs are still missing. But you're... She searched for words. A handrail. Something solid I can hold while I navigate the gaps. That's all I am? A tool? Her eyes met his, multifaceted and alien, and somehow achingly familiar. If that's all you were, I wouldn't request maximum exposure. I wouldn't position myself where your breath reaches me strongest. I wouldn't... She stopped, hand trembling slightly, as she raised it toward the membrane. Kyle matched the gesture, palm to palm with only the barrier between them. The heat from his hand fogged the surface. Serath pressed closer, and he could smell her. Faint mineral scent, like stone after rain, like something ancient and patient. Protocols prohibit contact, she whispered. I know. We can't touch. I know. But I want to. The admission seemed to cost her. Not because you're healing me, because you see me, the fragments, the missing stairs, and you stay anyway. Kyle's hand shook slightly against the membrane. That terrifies you. Yes. Does it terrify you? He thought about Europa, the gardens that demanded nothing except competence, the years he'd spent perfecting isolation because competence was easier than vulnerability. Yes, he said. They stayed like that, hands aligned, breath fogging the surface between them, both trembling with want and restraint and the recognition that needing someone and choosing them weren't separable anymore. The ship's cycles blurred together. Morning meant light, and Serath's eyes finding him, confirming presence. Evening meant darkness and the sound of her breathing stabilizing because he remained. Between hours of proximity that felt less clinical each day, Serath's neural fractures were healing, but slowly. The physicians measured progress in percentages so small they seemed designed to remind everyone, especially Kyle, that cure required sustained exposure. Indefinite presence. No endpoint defined. He should have resented it. The choice made for him, the billions depending on his compliance, the reduction of his life to functional necessity. Instead, he found himself grateful for the mandate that kept him here, in this chamber, watching Serath piece her consciousness back together in his presence. She moved differently now, more deliberately. When she positioned herself near the membrane, it wasn't just for optimal biochemical exchange. She chose angles where the light caught her crystalline skin, in ways she must have known he'd find beautiful, where he could see the steady rhythm of her breathing, the pulse visible at her throat, the small tremors that ran through her body when he moved closer. They developed a language without words. The tilt of her head meant she was struggling to hold coherence. The way she pressed her hand to the membrane meant she needed to confirm he was real. The small distance she maintained between her body and the barrier meant she was fighting the urge to cross it. Kyle had his own gestures, positioning himself at an angle that let her see his face clearly. The deliberate steadiness of his breathing when hers became irregular. The way his hand would hover near the membrane, not touching, offering presence without pressure. Tell me something true, Serath said one afternoon. The words were clear, consciousness holding steady. About what? You. Something you've never told anyone. Kyle leaned against the wall near the membrane, close enough that his breath fogged the surface. The woman I left on Earth. I told her I was leaving because I needed space, needed to focus on my work. But really I was afraid. Of what? That she'd see me clearly. All the parts I'd kept hidden, the selfishness, the cowardice, the way I shut down instead of fighting for things that mattered. I convinced myself leaving was noble, giving her freedom to find someone better. He laughed without humor. I was just running. Sarath was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Did you love her?" "Yes. Not enough to stay, or maybe too much to let her see who I actually was." "Do you think," Sarath said carefully, "that running made you safer, or just lonelier?" "Both. Same thing sometimes." She moved closer to the membrane, close enough that he could see individual facets in her eyes, each reflecting his image slightly differently. "I understand that. Before the plague, I had someone, another researcher. We orbited each other for years, never quite connecting. I was afraid of what it would mean, to be seen by one mind when I'd always been part of collective consciousness. To choose one person as more important than billions." "What happened?" "The plague." She fragmented early, chose void sleep rather than endure isolation. Sarath's hand trembled against the membrane. "I never told her I'd been choosing her. Every day, over everything else. Just never had the courage to make it real." Kyle placed his hand opposite hers. The barrier between them felt infinitely thin and absolutely impassable. "I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me something." Her voice dropped lower. "That choosing someone matters more than being with them. That want is braver than need. Is that what this is?" Kyle's pulse hammered in his throat. "Want?" Sarath's eyes held his. "You tell me. Am I here because I'm dying, or because you're the first person who looked at my fragments and didn't flinch?" "Both," Kyle said. "Same thing sometimes." She smiled, or the Valen equivalent, a subtle shift in the crystalline patterns of her face. "We're a matched set. Two people competent at isolation, terrible at anything else. Maybe we could be terrible at it together." The words hung between them, half joke, half confession. Sarath pressed closer to the membrane, and Kale matched her, their bodies aligned with only the barrier between. He could feel the heat of her through the surface, different from human warmth but just as real. "The protocols," Sarath whispered. "I know. We can't—" "I know. But if we could—" Kale's hand spread flat against the membrane, and Sarath covered it with hers on the opposite side. Not touching, but the approximation of touch, the promise of it, the ache of wanting and being separated by rules designed to protect them both. They stayed like that until the light cycled to evening, neither willing to be the first to retreat. The physicians reviewed progress reports in frequencies Kyle couldn't hear but felt in his bones. Sarath's neural fractures were stabilizing, healing measured in microscopic increments. Success, clinically speaking. Proof the treatment worked. What they didn't measure was how many hours Sarath and Kyle spent at the membrane, hands aligned, breathing synchronized. How conversations deepened into territory neither had explored with anyone. How the space between them hummed with tension that had nothing to do with biochemical healing and everything to do with the recognition that they'd found someone who understood isolation so completely that choosing connection became revolutionary. "My assignment rotates in 3 weeks," Kale said one morning. The words felt like stones in his throat. Sarath went very still. "They told you that?" "Routine check-in. They'll move me to the next patient. Someone else infected, fragmented, needing human presence." He couldn't look at her. "Standard protocol rotation." "And me. Continued exposure therapy. Different human. Same treatment." The silence that followed had weight. Kyle forced himself to meet her eyes, watching fractures reform in real time, not from the plague but from something worse. The understanding that he was temporary, replaceable despite being irreplaceable, that whatever had grown between them existed inside clinical parameters designed to prevent exactly this kind of attachment. "I see," Sarath said finally. Her voice carried no inflection, consciousness fragmenting toward protective numbness. "Sarath, it's logical. You're needed elsewhere. I'm stabilized enough for transition. This was always temporary." "That's not—" Kyle stopped. What could he say? That he didn't want to leave. That the thought of breathing in someone else's proximity felt like betrayal. That 3 weeks felt simultaneously too long and nowhere near enough. None of it changed the reality. He was resource. She was patient, Rotation was protocol. Serath turned away from the membrane, retreating to her bed. The distance between them felt suddenly immense, a gap that had always existed, but that proximity had let them forget. Kyle wanted to call her back, to press against the membrane and demand she look at him, demand they acknowledge what had been building between hands that couldn't touch and words spoken close enough to share breath. Instead, he returned to his own bed, lay down and stared at the ceiling. The ship's ventilation hummed. Serath's breathing remained steady but felt distant, as if she'd pulled consciousness back inside protective barriers he couldn't cross, even if the membrane disappeared. They spent the rest of the day in separate corners of their chambers. No proximity, no conversation. The physician's monitors would show reduced therapeutic effectiveness, biochemical markers shifting away from optimal range. Kyle didn't care. He'd spent 6 years on Europa perfecting the art of isolation. He knew how to protect himself by creating distance. It had never hurt this much before. Days passed in careful politeness. Serath attended the exposure sessions because treatment required it. Kyle provided presence because protocol demanded it. They maintained the bare minimum proximity, exchanged pleasantries about her recovery progress, discussed nothing that mattered. The physicians noted declining effectiveness but said nothing. Neural fractures had stabilized. Healing had plateaued. Good enough, clinically. Rotation remained on schedule. Kyle spent hours in his chamber alone, staring at the membrane and remembering how Serath's hand had trembled against it when she'd asked if he was there by choice or necessity. How he'd said both and meant it. How neither of them had acknowledged that both could evolve into something else entirely, something that made rotation feel like amputation. On the 15th day of careful distance, Serath spoke without looking at him. "I've been thinking about what you said, about running from Earth." Kale had been reviewing agricultural reports from Europa, desperate for any distraction. He set them aside. "And? You said you were afraid she'd see you clearly, all the parts you kept hidden." Serath finally turned toward him. What if she already had? What if she saw everything and chose you anyway, and you left because you didn't believe you deserved that choice? The words landed like precision strikes. Kyle's chest tightened. "What's your point? That you're doing it again? You have 3 weeks and you're spending them maintaining clinical distance because it's safer than admitting this matters. That I matter. That walking away in 21 days will cost you something real. Admitting it doesn't change anything. I still leave. You still get someone else. Acknowledging what this is only makes it hurt more." "Good," Serath said fiercely. "Let it hurt. Let it matter. Because the alternative is spending 3 weeks pretending we're nothing to each other, and then carrying that emptiness for however long we have left." Kyle stood, moved to the membrane. "What do you want from me?" "Honesty, presence, the courage to choose connection even when you know it's temporary." She mirrored his movement, stopping close enough that he could see the fractures in her neural casing. Healing, but never to be whole again. "I spent years not telling someone she mattered. Then she was gone and I had nothing except regret. I won't do that again." "This is impossible," Kyle said. "The protocols are about physical contact, not about—" She pressed her hand to the membrane. "This, being seen, choosing someone, letting them matter even when every rational calculation says protection requires distance." Kale's hand rose to match hers, muscle memory overriding fear. The barrier fogged between their palms. "I don't know how to do this, any of this. Neither do I, but we could be terrible at it together. For 3 weeks, for however long we have." Her eyes held his. "Unless you'd rather run again." The challenge hung between them, sharp as the fractures in her neural casing. Kyle could retreat, maintain distance, arrive in 21 days at rotation with clinical detachment intact, and nothing gained except the certainty that he'd preserved his isolation. Or he could choose otherwise. He spread his fingers against the membrane, and Serath matched the gesture, aligned palm to palm. "Tell me something true," he said. "I'm terrified," Serath whispered, "of you leaving, of caring this much, of how much it's going to hurt when they assign me someone else who'll provide presence without seeing me. Keep going. I want these 3 weeks, every minute of them. I want to memorize how your breathing sounds, how your voice changes when you're being honest, how your hand feels through this barrier even though we're not touching. I want it all, Even knowing it ends. Especially knowing it ends. Kyle's throat felt tight. My turn. Please. I think I've been alone so long that I forgot what it was like to want someone specific, not just human connection in the abstract. You, your mind, fragments and all. The way you see through my careful distance to who I actually am. He paused. And I'm furious at the universe for giving me this. You, with a deadline. Then we'll make the deadline matter. They stood like that, hands aligned through the membrane, breathing synchronized, choosing each other for however long they had. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was real. 18 days left. Kyle started counting without meaning to, marking time like a sentence. Serath did the same. He saw it in how she tracked the light cycles, in how she positioned herself to maximize every permitted hour of proximity. They stopped pretending the attachment was clinical. Serath requested maximum exposure daily, and Kyle arrived early, stayed late, filled every allowed minute. They talked about everything, her research, his gardens, the specific loneliness of being competent and empty, the ways they'd both chosen isolation as protection and paid for it in decades of careful distance from anything that mattered. What will you do? Serath asked one afternoon. After. Go where they send me. Next patient. Same protocols. Kyle couldn't make it sound neutral. And after that? I don't know. There are billions infected. The rotation could last years. He looked at his hands. They keep telling me how essential I am, how many lives depend on my presence. Do you believe them? About being essential? Yes. About that making it right? He shook his head. I don't know anymore. Serath moved closer to the membrane, close enough that he could see his reflection in her multifaceted eyes. What if you had a choice? Real choice. No pressure, no billions depending on your answer. Would you stay? The question he'd been avoiding. Kyle met her eyes. With you? With me. 16 days left, and he was admitting what terrified him most. Yes, if it were possible. If the choice was only about what I wanted. Yes. Serath's hand trembled as she raised it to the membrane. Kyle matched her, palm to palm, the barrier between them both absolute and meaningless. They'd developed 1,000 ways to approximate touch, hands aligned, breathing synchronized, positioning themselves close enough to share warmth through the membrane. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was what they had. I need to tell you something, Serath said quietly. The physicians ran updated scans. My neural fractures, they're stabilized, not healed completely, but... She paused. I don't need constant exposure anymore. Periodic sessions would suffice. Kale's chest went cold. They're rotating me early? No, they don't know yet. I haven't reported the progress. Her eyes held his. I should. It's dishonest not to. But reporting means they'll reduce your assignment, move you faster. Why are you telling me? Because you deserve truth and choice. Serath's voice shook slightly. I could report now. Give you back weeks of your life. Send you to someone who actually needs you. Or I could stay silent. Keep requesting maximum exposure. Steal time we don't have ethical claim to. Kyle stared at her, understanding the weight of what she was offering. What do you want? I want you to stay, selfishly, completely. I want every minute you'll give me, even knowing I'm keeping you from people with greater need. Her hand pressed harder against the membrane. But I won't decide for you. If you want to go, if knowing I'm stabilized changes what this is, tell me now. 14 days left, possibly fewer, if Serath reported her progress. Kale looked at her, neural fractures healing, consciousness coherent, no longer dying but still fragmented in ways that would never fully repair. She didn't need him to survive. She needed him anyway, and he needed her. Don't report it, he said. Not yet. Kyle, I know. It's selfish, unethical. There are people fragmenting who need me more. He spread his fingers against the membrane. But I'm choosing this. You. However long we have. Serath matched his gesture, and they stood breathing together, choosing each other over reason, over duty, over every rational calculation that said otherwise. 10 days. 9. 8. Time contracted and expanded simultaneously. Hours of proximity passed like minutes. Nights stretched infinite, both lying in separate beds, listening to each other breathe across the chamber divide. They'd stopped talking about rotation. Instead, they existed in increasingly desperate presence. Hands at the membrane, faces close enough to share breath through the barrier, conversations that circled closer and closer to the question neither could answer. What happens after? Cale had started researching, quietly using ship access he probably wasn't supposed to have, looking for alternatives, loopholes, anything that might change the trajectory they were locked into. He found nothing useful. Consortium protocols were absolute. Treatment required human presence, rotation prevented attachment complications, billions needed care. Individual desire, his, Serath's, rated below statistical noise in the decision matrix. 7 days left when Serath asked, "Do you regret it? Agreeing to come here?" Kyle thought about Europa, his gardens, 6 years of careful isolation. No. Even knowing how it ends? Especially knowing how it ends. He moved closer to the membrane. I spent 6 years competent and empty. 3 months here I've felt real, present, like I matter beyond function. "You do," Serath said fiercely. "You matter to me. Not because you're human, not because you're healing me, because you see me. Fragments, gaps, everything I can't fix, and you stay anyway." "Is that enough?" Kyle pressed his hand to the membrane. "Mattering to each other while the universe has other plans?" "It has to be." She matched his gesture. "Because it's all we have. 6 days, 5. The physicians ran routine scans. Cale held his breath, waiting for them to discover what Serath had been hiding, that she'd stabilized enough to reduce treatment, that his presence had become preference rather than medical necessity. The results came back showing continued healing, nothing dramatic enough to alter protocols. Rotation remained scheduled. Serath met his eyes across the chamber afterward, and he saw the relief and guilt warring in her expression. They were stealing time. Both knew it. Neither could stop. 4 days left when the ship's communications system chimed in Cale's chamber. Not the routine medical updates, something else, priority channel. He activated it reluctantly. "Vance. Dr. Vance, this is High Counselor Thren. I'm reaching out regarding your assignment." Kyle's pulse spiked. "Has something changed?" "We're accelerating your rotation. New infections emerging, critical cases requiring immediate intervention. You'll transfer in 48 hours instead of 4 days. The chamber tilted. That's not... "Compensation will be adjusted accordingly. Transport arrives day after tomorrow. Prepare for transfer." The connection severed. Kyle stood frozen, staring at the dark screen. 2 days. They'd been counting down to 4, stealing every possible hour, and now even that was being cut short. He looked at Serath. She'd heard. Sound carried through the membrane. Her face had gone completely still, consciousness fragmenting toward the protective numbness he recognized. "Serath, it's fine." Her voice was flat. "Logical. I'm stable enough for transition. You're needed elsewhere." "Stop." Kyle moved to the membrane, pressed both hands against it. "Don't do that. Don't retreat. What choice do we have?" She wouldn't look at him. It was always temporary. 2 days or 4 doesn't change the mathematics. It changes everything. "How?" She finally met his eyes, and her pain was fracture deep. "How does 2 days change that you leave and I stay, and someone else provides presence and neither of us gets a choice about any of it?" Kyle had no answer. She was right. 2 days, 4 days, 4 weeks. None of it changed the trajectory. He'd leave. She'd continue treatment with someone else. The galaxy would keep turning, indifferent to what they wanted. But 48 hours, 2 days. Not enough for anything except the certainty of what they were losing. "I don't want this," Kyle said. The admission felt like tearing something vital loose. "Any of it. I don't want to leave. I don't want someone else in this chamber. I don't want to spend the rest of whatever assignment I have pretending this didn't matter." Serath's hands rose to match his, pressed against the membrane hard enough that the barrier fogged between them. "Then stay." "I can't." "Stay." Her voice broke. "Report that I've destabilized. That reducing exposure would be catastrophic. Make them believe you're essential." "Serath, that's a lie?" "Yes. Unethical. Absolutely." Tears, or the Valen equivalent, tracked down her crystalline face. But I don't care. I don't care about ethics or protocols or billions needing you. I care about you. Here, with me, for longer than 48 hours. Cale felt something crack open in his chest. I can't do that to you. Make you dependent on a lie. I'm already dependent on you. The lie is pretending otherwise. They stood trembling against the membrane, the space between them charged with everything they couldn't say, couldn't fix, couldn't change. 2 days. 48 hours. Then separation, replacement, the careful architecture of what they'd built dismantled by protocol and necessity, and the weight of billions who needed his presence somewhere else. Tell me what you want, Kyle whispered. Real answer. Sarath's eyes held his. I want you to stay. I want to choose you over everything. Duty, ethics, reason. I want to be selfish enough to believe that mattering to each other outweighs mattering to the galaxy. And if staying means someone else fragments, someone who needs me more, then we live with that weight, together. Or you leave with clear conscience and I live with the weight of losing you. She pressed harder against the membrane. But don't leave pretending it doesn't cost you. Don't give me noble distance, give me honest grief. Cale's hands shook against the barrier. 2 days. He could spend them in careful clinical detachment, protecting them both from the pain of attachment. Or he could spend them being honest about what this was, what she'd become, what leaving would cost. I'm staying, he said, however long they give us. And when I leave, his voice cracked. When I leave, you'll know exactly how much this cost, how much you matter, how much I wish the universe gave us different mathematics. Sarath's breath hitched. They stood like that, hands aligned, choosing honesty over protection, pain over numbness, each other over every rational reason to maintain distance. 48 hours. They would make them count. The ship continued its trajectory through consortium space, indifferent to the revolution happening in one small medical chamber. Kyle and Sarath stopped sleeping. 2 days wasn't enough to waste on unconsciousness. They talked through the first night, sharing everything they'd avoided. Sarath describing her life before the plague in detail she'd never managed before, consciousness holding steady in Cale's presence, research breakthroughs and failures, the colleague she'd loved and lost to void sleep, the specific terror of feeling her mind fragment while knowing clinically exactly what was being destroyed. Cale told her about the woman on Earth, Emma her name was, and saying it aloud felt like confession. How they'd met in university, built something real, let it fracture under the weight of his fear and her patience running out. How he'd convinced himself that leaving was freedom for them both, when really it was just cowardice with distance. Do you think she forgave you? Sarath asked. I don't know. I never asked. Cale laughed bitterly. I was very competent at leaving. Never did get good at staying. You stayed here. Because I had to. No. Sarath's hand pressed against the membrane. You stayed here because you chose to. Duty got you in the chamber. Everything after, that was choice. Kyle wanted to argue, to maintain the fiction that his presence had been purely protocol. But Sarath saw through it, had been seeing through it from the beginning. He'd stayed because somewhere between monitoring her breathing and learning to read her fractures, she'd become essential in ways that had nothing to do with billions needing treatment. What happens after I leave? He asked quietly. Someone else arrives, provides presence. I heal or I don't. Sarath's voice stayed steady. But I won't forget this, you. How it felt to be seen completely and chosen anyway. That's not enough. No, but it's real. That has to count for something. They watched each other as ship morning brightened their chambers, neither willing to waste time sleeping. The physicians checked in, noted increased stress markers, said nothing about early rotation. Kyle had filed the required acknowledgement. Transfer in 36 hours, next assignment prepared, protocols memorized. Bureaucracy that felt surreal when Sarath sat 3 meters away, close enough to see but forever untouchable. Tell me something about Earth, Sarath said that afternoon. Something specific. I want to be able to picture where you came from. Cale thought. There's a park in Seattle, near the university. In spring, the cherry trees bloom. Thousands of them, all at once. Pink and white petals everywhere, covering the ground, getting caught in people's hair. It's brief. 2 weeks maximum before the petals fall and the trees go green. But while it lasts... He stopped, memory sharp enough to hurt. While it lasts, Serath prompted. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. The impermanence makes it more beautiful, not less. Because you know it's temporary, you pay attention. Every petal matters. Serath's eyes held his. Like this. Yes, like this. 24 hours, 12, 6. They'd developed a new routine, facing each other across the membrane, hands aligned, close enough that breath fogged the barrier between them. Not talking sometimes, just being present. Witnessing each other's existence in silence. Kyle memorized her like he'd memorized botanical specimens, the exact pattern of fractures in her neural casing, the way light refracted through crystalline skin, the specific rhythm of her breathing when consciousness held steady. He wanted to remember everything, as if perfect recall could substitute for presence. It couldn't, but he tried anyway. "I wish I could touch you," Serath whispered during one of those silent vigils. "Not for healing, just to know what it felt like. Your hand, your face, proof that we're both real." Kyle's throat ached. "Me too. If things were different, they're not. But if they were, if there was no plague, no protocols, no billions needing you, would you—" She stopped, reformulating. "Would I be enough? Just me, fragments and all? No medical necessity forcing proximity?" Kyle looked at her. Really looked, seeing past the alien features to the mind behind them. Brilliant and broken and brave enough to ask for honesty instead of comfortable lies. "You'd be everything," he said. Serath's breath caught. "Don't say that if you don't mean it." "I mean it." His hand pressed harder against the membrane. "I spent 6 years running from anything that might matter. Then I met you and suddenly I wanted to stay. Not because protocol demanded it, because you made isolation feel like waste. Like I'd been competent at the wrong thing my entire life. What's the right thing? This. Choosing someone. Being seen. Letting it matter even when, especially when, it's temporary." He paused. "You taught me that. Cherry blossoms. They stayed like that through final hours. Hands aligned, breathing synchronized, memorizing what they couldn't keep. The transport arrived precisely on schedule. Kyle had packed the single bag he'd brought, added nothing from 3 months aboard the medical vessel. Possessions felt absurd when he was leaving the only thing that mattered. The physicians conducted final evaluations. Serath's neural fractures stabilized, consciousness coherent within acceptable parameters, ready for transition to next phase treatment, clinical success. They congratulated Kyle on effective proximity therapy. He said nothing. Words felt impossible. Serath underwent the evaluation with perfect composure, answering questions about cognitive function and fragmentation frequency. She didn't mention how many hours they'd spent at the membrane, didn't tell them she'd been stable enough to reduce treatment for weeks, maintained the fiction that his presence remained medically essential right up until the moment it ended. The physicians left them alone for final transition. 30 minutes. Then transport departure. Kyle stood at the membrane and Serath mirrored him. They'd said everything during the long hours of countdown. Now, facing actual separation, words failed. "I don't know how to do this," Kyle finally managed. "Neither do I." Serath's hand rose to the membrane. "But we will because we have to." "That's not fair." "No, nothing about this is fair." She spread her fingers against the barrier. "But we had this. 3 months of being seen. That's more than a lot of beings get in entire lifetimes." Kyle matched her gesture, palm to palm through the membrane that had separated them from the beginning. "It's not enough. It never would have been." Serath's voice stayed steady, but her hand trembled. "If we'd had years, decades, it wouldn't change that I want more. That's not about time. It's about you. Don't." Kyle's chest felt crushed. "Don't make this harder." "Why not? If it's hard, it matters." "If it matters, it was real." She pressed closer to the membrane. "I need you to know when they assign someone else, when another human provides presence and I heal completely, it won't be the same. They won't be you." "Serath." "Let me finish." Her eyes held his with desperate intensity. "You asked me what happens after you leave. Here's the truth. I'll heal. I'll recover. I'll rebuild whatever consciousness the plague destroyed. But there will always be a gap where you were. A missing stare I'll feel every time I remember what it was like to be known this completely." Kyle felt something break. I can't leave you with that. You don't have a choice. Neither do I. She paused. But I'm grateful anyway, for the breaking, for proof that I can still feel something this deeply, that fragments can recognize wholeness even if they can't achieve it. The ship's comm chimed. 5 minutes to transport departure. They stood frozen, hands aligned, facing the impossible mathematics of separation. What will you do? Serath asked. Next assignment, and after. I don't know. Kyle looked at their hands, separated by the barrier. Keep providing presence. Keep being essential. Try not to think about, he stopped. About me. About what I'm leaving behind. What this cost. He met her eyes. About the fact that I found exactly what I'd been running from, and the universe gave us just long enough to recognize it before taking it away. 2 minutes. Kale. Serath's voice carried weight he couldn't name. When this is over, when you've completed whatever rotations they assign, when you're finally free to choose, don't, he said. Don't give me hope for something that's years away, if it happens at all. I'm not giving hope. I'm stating intention. She pressed both hands to the membrane now, and he matched her. When you're free to choose, I'll be here, healed, whole as I'll ever be. And if you want, if any part of you still remembers what this was, find me. That's impossible. So was this. We did it anyway. Her hands shook against the barrier. I'm not asking for promises. Just don't forget that you matter, that we mattered. That choosing each other over every rational reason not to was the sanest thing either of us ever did. The comm chimed final warning. Kyle had to go, had to walk out of this chamber, board the transport, breathe in someone else's proximity, while Serath learned to exist without him. He couldn't move. Go, Serath whispered. Please, before I ask you to stay, and we both know you can't. Kyle stepped back from the membrane. The space between them felt suddenly vast, a gap that had always existed but proximity had disguised. He picked up his bag, turned toward the door. Kyle. He looked back. Serath stood at the membrane, both hands pressed against it, face composed but eyes betraying everything she was holding back. Thank you for staying, for seeing me, for being terrible at isolation together. Cherry blossoms, he managed. Cherry blossoms, she echoed. He walked out before he could change his mind, before the weight of her presence could anchor him past the point of leaving. The corridor beyond felt sterile, empty, designed for function rather than life. Behind him, the chamber door sealed, protocols re-engaging, medical separation complete. Kyle made it to the transport before the grief hit. The new assignment was clinically identical. Medical chamber, transparent membrane, infected patient needing human proximity to survive. A Kelith researcher this time. Neural structure different from Valen but fragmentation patterns similar. Conscious one moment, scattered the next, dependent on Kyle's breathing to maintain coherence. He provided presence as protocol demanded. Sat in the chamber, let his biochemistry work its mysterious healing. Watched another mind piece itself back together in his proximity. It felt mechanical, empty. The Kelith researcher, Vosh, gender-neutral, brilliant in quantum mathematics, was polite, grateful, appropriately professional. They didn't ask personal questions, didn't request maximum exposure, took healing as clinical necessity, no more complicated than medication. Exactly what the protocols intended. Kyle should have been relieved. Professional distance meant no attachment, no pain at rotation's end. He could complete his assignments efficiently, help billions, maintain the isolation he'd perfected over years. Instead, he felt hollow. Weeks passed. Vosh stabilized, healed, transferred to next phase treatment. Kyle rotated to another patient, then another. Each assignment identical. Provide presence, witness healing, move on. The physicians praised his consistency, his effectiveness, his professional approach. No one mentioned that he'd stopped talking beyond required communication, that he spent off hours staring at chamber walls, not sleeping. That proximity had become mechanical performance instead of presence. He was competent at it. Perfectly, emptily competent. 6 months after leaving Serath, Kyle had completed 8 rotations. Thousands of hours providing presence while feeling absent. The physicians tracked his effectiveness through biochemical markers and healing rates. They didn't measure what he felt. Probably better that way. The assignments blurred together. Different species, identical fracturing, uniform need for human proximity. Kyle performed his function flawlessly, helped patient after patient stabilize, moved on without attachment, exactly what he'd been running toward on Europa. Competence without connection, function without witness, existence that required nothing except showing up and breathing. He'd gotten good at it again. It felt like dying. 7 months in, the High Council contacted him with new offer. Permanent position, specialized facility, sequential treatment protocols for critical cases. More infected patients needing his presence, more rotations, more years of being essential. He should have accepted immediately. The work mattered. Billions still fragmented, needing treatment. His presence saved lives, literal, measurable lives. Kyle looked at the offer and felt nothing except the weight of choosing function over meaning. Again. Forever. He filed response requesting time to consider. The council granted him 2 weeks. Kyle spent them completing his current assignment. Another researcher, another species, another consciousness, fragmenting and healing in his proximity without ever seeing him as anything except necessity. On day 13, his patient asked, "Do you enjoy this work?" Kyle looked up, startled by the personal question. "What?" "The proximity therapy, helping us heal. Does it—" They searched for words. "Does it fulfill you? Or is it just what you do?" He should have given the professional answer, discussed the importance of the work, the satisfaction of helping others, the privilege of being essential. Instead, he said, "I'm very good at it." "That's not the same thing." "No," Kyle admitted. "It's not." His patient, Threx, crystalline neural like Serath, but different coloring, different fracture patterns, tilted their head in what might have been concern. "There was someone else, before me. I can see it in how you provide presence. You're here, but you're also somewhere else, with someone else." Kyle's chest tightened.